This video is much less a critique and much less a book review than it is a set of warnings about problematic aspects of the approach to veganism, animal rights, ecological politics, in a book that I think is relatively famous, relatively influential at the moment, called Zoopolis, that is co-written by Sue Donaldson and Professor Will Kymlicka. This book approaches the issues from a perspective that's almost 180 degrees opposite to my own. It's astounding to me that someone can share my fundamental concerns about animal rights, veganism, ecology, and yet can have an approach politically that is so totally, radically incompatible to my own. So as such, it's a very stimulating and even somewhat shocking book for me to read. To give you an immediate sense of why this is so different from my own approach, this book begins with questions of how human beings take care of domesticated animals, pets, and those concerns are very much framed in terms of a citizens' rights approach to political science. Citizens' rights, citizens' responsibilities. So to give an example, this book is very much concerned with the scenario of who will pay for the veterinary care, the medical care for dogs and cats if a family owns dogs and cats, if they're pet owners, but that family is too poor to actually pay for the veterinary care for these animals. So the reality is, of course, in our world currently, people who are not wealthy enough to pay for a complex surgery for their dog or cat will currently just have that dog or cat killed. So if you're approaching this in terms of the rubric of citizens' rights, if you're looking at animals as citizens that have the right to live in the context of there being domesticated animals, household pets, then you're looking at whose responsibility is it to pay for their medical care, etc. So this is a set of sincere concerns that he works out logically. However, the logical extension of this rapidly becomes absurd. The book is genuinely concerned with the status of rats and snakes within cities, within our civilization, within our culture. And interestingly, it blames the legacy of the Christian religion for giving people a very negative view of rats and snakes, but these are not inherently evil animals, and the government should educate the public so that we have a more compassionate and helpful view towards rats and snakes. And again, it extends the rights of citizens partially to rats and snakes. Now, obviously, it is not saying that rats and snakes should have driver's licenses. It's not saying that dogs should have the right to vote, but this is a logical and coherent approach that breaks up the paradigm of human citizenship and then tries to, in a thorough and consistent way, apply that to the status of animals within our society. And that is part of the problem, in my opinion, is thinking of animals as members of our society. I'm a vegan. You may be surprised to hear me say that. Stick with the video for another couple minutes, and you'll see exactly why I say that. This trajectory that begins with a concern about how we care for and how we pay for caring for pets as members of society ultimately leads to a view that animals as members of society have a right and even an obligation to contribute their labor to our society. So examples include that it's justifiable to ride horses, for horses to provide the service of human beings riding on them, because these horses benefit, they have the benefits of citizens, including, I guess, the government paying for veterinary care, etc. But on the other hand, they're also supposed to be contributing to our society. They're supposed to have obligations to our society, like citizens. And most absurd, this even extends to a justification for human beings eating chicken eggs. So chickens, the labor of chickens, the exploitation of the labor of chickens, the contribution of chickens as workers to our society can include chickens laying eggs and human beings eating those eggs as part of this social contract, this view of chickens as citizens in our society. So what started with a seemingly harmless and perfectly logical and perfectly vegan view of animal rights and a political science approach to animal rights in 2016 ends up embracing what seem to me absurdities that are in fact anti-vegan and even anti-animal rights. Now, again, for me, this is especially kind of intellectually stimulating, although I admit it's also laughable. I did laugh out loud reading this stuff. Keeping it real. This book really begins with and puts tremendous emphasis on the status of domesticated animals as household pets, which I do not. I regard the domestication of animals for human entertainment as itself immoral and unvegan. I think that taking a wild animal and reducing it to being a plaything and a toy and a decoration is itself already a form of animal exploitation that I do not approve of. It's normalized culturally in our society, but if we're going to question why culturally we think rats and snakes are evil, maybe we could question why we think it's acceptable to castrate a dog so that the dog will not display the behaviors of a wolf, to force the dog to decorate your carpet and play with your children and be an amenable member of your household. Those are also cultural assumptions. And now, in fact, the assumptions we have about snakes are not completely ill-founded. The problems we have with rats are not totally pseudoscientific. Rats eat grain. Rats eat almost everything human beings eat. If you let the rat population or the cockroach population go unchecked in a modern city, you have all kinds of problems. If you let the rat population go unchecked on a grain farm, a perfectly vegan grain farm, you're not going to have a grain farm for too long. Growing wheat involves killing rats. In Canada, it involves killing a remarkable array of our native species. And that is very problematic, and I think the ethics of that are worth examining. But we actually can't examine those ethical issues or best practices under the rubric of extending citizenship rights to animals, which, again, I'm not here to ridicule it, but that is the project that Kymlicka and Donaldson undertake in this book, Zoopolis, and it's even in the title, Zoopolis. This is extending the polity, extending political citizenship rights to animals as a kind of thoroughgoing intellectual experiment, or as a proposal for a radical new approach to ecology, animal rights, vegan politics, etc. My approach, instead, very much begins with habitat conservation and the status of wild animals, and of them not needing our care, their status as independent from human society, or as independent as possible from human society. And in this book, that's very much left as the last and the least concern. It's almost a kind of embarrassing footnote or appendix to an approach to animal rights that is very much centered on, again, this is my opinion, this is my analysis, I feel their paradigm is to look at household pets such as dogs and cats and their rights as citizens, and then to extend it from there. And then we kind of have a footnote for animals in the wild. My approach is 180 degrees the opposite. I believe the dignified lives of animals, whether we're talking about lions or wolves, is to look at how they can live in the wild. I do think that human beings have a tremendously important role in the 21st century, partly because we need to maintain national parks, nature reserves, conservation areas. We need to prevent our fellow human beings from cutting down all the trees if there's going to be a forest. We do need a role for government and for charity, for organized oversight of these conservation areas, etc. However, the lives of those animals, I feel profoundly, are not ours to govern, or we have to govern them to a minimum extent. Yes, we have to intervene if a species is about to go extinct. We may have to intervene if there's a sudden disease outbreak within a national park and a population of animals will be wiped out. There are all kinds of reasons for intervention. One species is getting overpopulated and another is getting underpopulated. One type of plant is disappearing because there are too many of a certain type of insect. Yes, that's why I use the term wildlife management paradigm. I don't talk about nature red in tooth and fang. I don't talk about real untamed wilderness. In the 21st century, human beings will have a role in maintaining those parks. But the lives of animals, I feel, are not as castrated, medicated playthings, modified, literally declawed and defanged to be human pets. And I would approach this in absolutely the opposite way, where for me, chapter 1, the central, the main point, is to talk about the relationship between human society and the wild. And again, for me, that is intermediated by wildlife management. And then to talk about, if we're going to talk about citizenship at all, I think I would probably talk about how irrelevant it is to this question. That interestingly, the whole paradigm, basically since classical liberalism, basically since the rewriting of constitutions and the rewriting of economics textbooks under classical liberalism, the whole approach how we conceptualize politics has very much marginalized and left as a matter of minor concern, if it's mentioned at all, the question of national parks, of conservation areas, of nature preserves. That's not what our constitutions are about. That's not what the rights and responsibilities and role of the citizen are about. And it's also not how the rights and role and responsibility of the government are defined. And I do not know of any country in the world, maybe there's an exception, where the head of the National Park Service is an elected position. You may elect the mayor, you may elect the sheriff, you may elect a whole array of specific jobs. You may, in your country, elect the Surgeon General, who's in charge of medicine. You may elect, all of these special roles. I don't know any country in the world where the management of national parks, the conservation of nature, the protection of, sometimes very iconic species, whether they're bears or elephants, down to the smallest insects and snails. I do not know any country where that was taken seriously enough to be an elected position. This is a sign of how alien and minor these concerns have been. And then, for me, I would work backwards compared to Kymlicka's book here, compared to Zoopolis, and I really see the whole role of domesticated animals as something our society is in a transition toward abolishing. I don't have to preach that we need to abolish the labor of horses. It's already happening, due to technological advancement. I don't even feel I have to preach the abolition of chicken eggs, because science has conveniently proven that chicken eggs are tremendously unhealthy. They're unnecessary, unhealthy food that we should eliminate from the human diet, partly just because of cholesterol and many other reasons. Now, yes, I would like to see the complete abolition of factory farming. I don't think I'm going to see that in my lifetime, but of course, veganism has this aspiration to one day form a society somewhere on some scale where there is absolutely no, mass exploitation of, mass slaughtering of animals. Professor Kymlicka has made many positive contributions to the field. I feel I should note that he really has repeatedly raised the question of the difficulty of the connection between conventional left-wing politics, labor-based, labor union-centered left-wing politics, and any kind of animal rights paradigm, vegan paradigm, or even ecological paradigm. That's actually a really important line of inquiry. And if you have experience in politics wherever you are in the world, but I assume the Western world, Germany, Canada, United States, what have you, if you ever point out those difficulties where you have to say, look, the left wing just does not make a place for us as ecological or vegan or animal rights people, and vice versa, the connection from us reaching out to them is also pretty weak. So how is this really going to work? Very often you get defensive. Frankly, people get angry, people get hostile, and they don't want to think about how problematic that pairing really is. There's just a cultural assumption that there's something inherently left-wing about ecological conservation or ecological concern, and that the right wing is the inevitable enemy of whether it's biodiversity conservation or veganism or what have you. Now, if you live in the United States, believe me, I'm not about to preach to you that the Republican Party is a great place for vegan activism. I can't say in England that the Conservative Party is either. But Kymlicka, I think, has really made a very important contribution in pointing out just how problematic. I think he tends to focus on since the 1960s, the redefinition of left-wing 1960s. Maybe he's also written about earlier periods. I'm sorry. That's just my recollection of his work. But, in terms of cultural, political, legal reality of what the left wing is, just how poorly suited it is for vegans and people who are sincerely interested in ecology to get involved with. And, vice versa, we have to say self-critically, I don't know any vegans who are highly motivated today to try to infiltrate the labor unions, who think, wow, if we want to advance veganism, the way to do it is to try to co-opt labor unions. Not at all. I know maybe back in the 1960s or something, somebody did think that. So there's actually a lack of anyone positive reaching out to work with the other in both directions. So I do think Professor Kymlicka is someone who has made many important contributions, has raised important questions for us to consider. Zoopolis, I think, is a very deeply flawed book. I think that it does, in a rigorous, logical way, follow up on a set of thematic concerns. I think it is completely logical for this citizenship paradigm to look at animals as members of our society and then conclude that they have the right to work, and then conclude that human beings have an obligation to exploit them, to exploit their labor as in their status as voiceless citizens within our society. It's logical. I can recognize why he starts with one set of problems and comes to this set of solutions. I also think it's bad and it's immoral and it's wrong. In this video, now past 15 minutes, I have not discussed each and every issue raised in the book. It would be a much longer video if I did. I think that what I'm doing here is giving you a set of warnings that are really useful, in the same way that an ecologist might give you a set of warnings about air pollution, the use of cars, or anything else, without really giving you a complete explanation of how cars work or how power generation relies on air pollution. I think it is useful in this kind of context to just give you a select group of issues to whet your skepticism. It is possible that within the pages of this tome you find other insights that are of real value. For me, it is largely a reflection on how ill-suited the whole tradition of Western political science is to veganism, in the same way that Kymlicka made this contribution in reflecting on how ill-suited the whole left-wing tradition is to veganism. So that also, for me, is a somewhat stimulating parallel to reflect on.